Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. May 15th was the anniversary of the Nakba, of the catastrophe in Palestine, when at least 700,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes and thrown off of their land. Many Palestinians were killed in the process. In 1948, Zionists took over parts of Palestine to form what it called a Jewish state. Since then, there have been many so-called peace talks and peace agreements between Israel and the PLO, which have come and gone. The results have been the same: more Palestinian land being taken, and at least 6 million Palestinians now living outside of Palestine. Well, stay with us as we take a look at the latest situation with the Palestinians and their country that has been occupied by the Zionists.
The people of a forgotten war. That's how many describe Palestinians living in camps and shanty towns scattered across West Asia. These are the refugees who are still hopeful that one day they would be able to return to their homeland, Palestine. They are both first-generation refugees and their descendants who were forced out of their home by the occupying Zionist forces. Many had no choice but to cross into neighboring countries where they have been living in refugee camps since then. However, they haven't lost hope, rather waiting and keeping their right of return alive. But what is the right of return? When Israeli forces started the first phase of their occupation of Palestine in 1948, up to 800,000 Palestinians were forced to flee their homes for Jordan, Syria and Lebanon. Over 350,000 more sought refuge in 1967. Today, the number of registered Palestinian refugees account to over 6 million. These refugees insist they have a right to return to their land and have a right to own the property they themselves or their forebears left behind or the Israelis forcibly took away from them. While they have been calling for the same for decades, nothing has changed legally, politically or diplomatically.
نعيش بكرامة أول شيء لأنه إحنا فلسطينية شعب معطر حقوقنا ضايعة صرنا 70 سنة بيقولوا لنا حق العودة حق العودة الصراحة ما عدا.
The UN General Assembly passed a Resolution 194 in December 1948, formally recognizing the right of return of the Palestinians. The resolution stipulates that the refugees wishing to return to their homes should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. It also stresses that those choosing not to return should be compensated for loss of or damage to property. The resolution was adopted by a majority vote, with 35 of 58 UN members then endorsing it. Ironically, all 6 Arab League countries voted against the resolution. Decades have passed since then, and Palestinians are still waiting for the right to return to their home.
بن-غوريون لما قال إنه الأطفال بكرة الاختيارية بيموتوا أو كبار السن بيموتوا والأطفال بينسوا، لا إحنا بنقول له إنه أطفالنا ما راح ينسوا لأنه الاختيارية علموهم وين أرضهم وين هم رايحين وين يجوا.
Over the past 70 years, the UN has passed hundreds of resolutions on Palestinian rights, but the will of the majority of the international community has been overruled by a handful of those siding with the Israeli expansionism. The right of return is a universally recognized right in international law, but the Palestinians have failed to get it since they don't have great lobbies in international arenas. However, they are still hopeful that one day they would go back to their homes and live in peace.
I'd like to welcome my guest, author and editor-in-chief, American Herald Tribune, Anthony Hull out of Lethbridge, author and Middle East affairs expert, Saeb Sha'ath out of Belfast. Welcome both of you to the program. Let me start off with Anthony. Anthony, do you think that there is a political solution to the Palestinian-Israeli situation?
Well, we have to have some optimism about the future, but right now, with the deal of the century being promoted as if it's somehow a negotiated settlement, when every Palestinian one can imagine in the world, as far as I know, is against it. There's no constituency for this deal of the century. Who came up with that title? P.T. Barnum? So imagine this travesty of making a deal about a people where the people being transacted with aren't present. It's part of this agenda for greater Israel that Jabotinsky had, came up with his views in the 1920s. It simply goes from Begin to, now Netanyahu, this Likudnik thing. There's a background to it. Israel has no fixed borders. It's a moving frontier. So right now, I'll say yes, there is hope for a political settlement, but under these circumstances, we're dealing with a very telling situation, which shows what kind of loony bins are coming up with the deal of the century.
Okay. Well, Saeb, do you think that the establishment of Israel is the epitome of the failure of the international community in actually protecting the sovereignty of a country, Palestine?
It's definitely that since the time when they occupied Palestine, the British Empire itself mandated itself through the Nations League at the time, which controlled by them and the French and the Americans, to settle the Zionists, the Jews, to cleanse them from Europe and put them in Palestine. In this regard, with all the nations, other nations, and with the people. It's the will of, or the might of the empire imposing its will on the people. That's what's happened, and that's what continues to happen under now the leader of the empire is the Americans. The same thing when you hear Donald Trump dismisses the international community, disregards all the United Nations resolutions, and says he recognizes Jerusalem al-Quds as the eternal capital of the Zionist entity. And then Pompeo stated that according to their deal or loot of the century, or deal of the century, it's up to the Zionist entity, Israel, quote unquote, to annex the parts it sees fit for it in the West Bank and the Valley of Jordan. Considering the Valley of Jordan even, it's the only main agriculture to feed the Palestinians and the gateway to the outside world. So they want to annex the Palestinians in Bundustans surrounded by colonies, armed colonies, Zionist armed colonies, to enslave what left in Palestine from people if they don't want to leave Palestine. This is the project. The project is to create a greater Zionist entity in there to implement the will of the United States and hegemony of the area. Okay,
stay with me, Saeb. Anthony, it has been 72 years since Palestinian land was taken and occupied. Now, this has happened with many countries for its occupation over the years, but usually due to force from other countries, pressure from other countries, the occupier is made to return the land. Why hasn't this occurred when dealing with Palestine?
Well, of course, Israel doesn't come out of a decolonization movement. Israel comes out of first British Balfour Declaration and then an alliance with the Americans. It comes out of, imperialism, classic imperialism. When this creation of Israel took place in 1948, there were 50 members of the United Nations. Now there's 192, and the vast majority of those new nations in the United Nations have been colonized themselves, have felt imperial expansion, negating their way of life, taking their resources and such. So the fact that the UN General Assembly, which doesn't have much formal power, but it has moral power, the fact that it represents a majority of people who have been colonized, who have just emerged from colonization, the fact that there are these hundreds of resolutions, one of the big ones being 242 of the General Assembly, which says that taking land through force, as happened in 1967, that can't be treated as legitimate in international law. So the illegitimacy of the Israeli entity right now is very clear, and these settlements which are the object of this movement of people in the world, and not only within the former colonies, but within the Western countries, the imperial powers, the former imperial powers too. This is a huge momentum in this movement, and just because Donald Trump has the deal of the century, it doesn't change the reality, the underlying reality.
Okay, well, Saeb, many talks have been held and treaties signed between the PLO and Israel over the years. What has really been accomplished by these? Because what we're seeing is that Palestinians have less and less land as this goes on. Your take on all of these agreements, so-called agreements and talks that have taken place?
You see, the Palestinians, they always stated the solution for the Holocaust, the democratic Palestine, which means all Palestine and the three religions can live in it, and all the people exist in it can live together. But you have to take out of the question Zionism. This was rejected by the State of Israel and Europe and the United States of America. So the Palestinian resistance from the 60s, 70s, in Jordan, they faced a massacre in the Black September, and then in Lebanon, continued attacks on them by Arabic reactionary regimes and by the Zionist entity till 1982. In 1982, there was before it something called Prince Fahd peace deal, which was supposed to the Palestinian to recognize the Zionist entity for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Palestinians refused that. Then after the war of 1982, occupying Beirut and kicking the PLO out of Beirut, there was an Arab summit in Morocco called FAS, Arab Summit, which they imposed on the Palestinians to accept what they call it the FAS peace plan, which was the Prince Fahd of Saudi Arabia at the time plan. So the Palestinians accepted that by force after being beaten and many thousands of them being killed and cleansed out of Lebanon and disputed all over the Arab world. So after that became on the back of it the Oslo agreement. After this is one of the push was Madrid Peace Treaty, and then they went to the Oslo agreement, which was supported by Saudi Arabia and the rest. And then after that, we have what we call the Arab Peace Initiative, which is the same exactly like FAS, Arab Summit, or Fahd, is to impose on the Palestinian to accept what left from Palestine in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But then, with normalization of the Arab states, with the Zionist entity and the encouragement of the United States of America and the West for them to neglect the Palestinian rights, we face that the Zionist entity don't agree with the right of return of the refugees, don't agree with surrendering East Jerusalem, Al-Quds, don't agree to give money or much of the lands of the West Bank. So all the deals and that turn the Palestinian Authority to be a guard for their settlements.
Well, what about that, Anthony? You heard what Saeb said and all the different agreements, and at the end of the day, Tel Aviv actually does not agree with returning land or having Palestinians return. So with Israel and not abiding by international law, for example, we see despite international law, more illegal settlements are being built. So when dealing with an entity like that, your take, is the only answer armed resistance against an entity like that or not?
Let me refer to history here. The backer of Israel right now, some say it's an extension of the United States. Is the United States becoming a kind of colony of Israel? Has the United States been so internally infiltrated in its Congress, in the White House and such, that it's really, the United States is a kind of extension of Israel? The praying mantis, the partner is devoured. So United States has this history of indigenous peoples, a genocide, a trail of tears that push all Indian peoples from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi in the time of Jackson, President Jackson, Trump reveres President Jackson. This is the model. And of course, the United States has this obsession with the Old Testament Calvinist tradition that, the founders of New England saw themselves as God's chosen people. So the extension of the Trail of Tears into the treatment of the Palestinians right now, well beyond an apartheid situation. I didn't notice South Africa bombing Bantustans, for instance. But this U.S. backing the fact that these narratives of the U.S. treatment of indigenous peoples sort of morphs into the Israeli treatment of indigenous peoples in Palestine, a genocidal treatment, and the right of return, of course, means that there is a Palestinian constituency that can't be so easily genocided, but there's plenty of Palestinians in place in Gaza and such who can be and are being genocided. So there's before a settlement occurs, we've got to get some kind of disengagement so that people aren't being killed, that people aren't being tortured, Palestinian people, that Israel isn't using these as kind of human experiments to apply now to the world on testing all kinds of peoples, indigenous peoples and other peoples based on the treatment of Palestinians. There's a lot to go through before we get to the final settlement.
Okay, well, Saeb, because we're really limited in our time, and keep the answers a little bit short. I want to get to a couple of different points. But Saeb, when we look at the current situation with U.S. President Donald Trump's administration's blanket support for Israel, even moving the American embassy to Jerusalem al-Quds, do you think that these type of actions will actually backfire on Israel because more Palestinians have realized that there is nothing to negotiate and that resistance is the only way for their survival? How do you see it?
Excellent question. Not just the United States. In the United States, in Europe, in general, globally, Palestinians gaining public support, a huge support. I can sense it in the UK, sense it in Ireland, in the United States of America, in the BDS movement. And part of this, the second phase to that, with the Palestinians seeing there is no way to deal with the Zionist entity except now the armed struggle. They tried all peace. I heard it with my own ear from the late Yasser Arafat. He said, we tried every way with them. It's the only way it is left to deal with those people is real armed struggle, popular war. And this is one. The other thing, Europe now, as the EU and Europe, who is feel they invested heavily in the two-state solution to secure a viable Zionist entity to grow and flourish in historical Palestine, but in condition to give the Palestinian another state in the West Bank, even controlled by the Zionist entity. This is failing now. The Europe see itself is supporting and contributing to an apartheid state in historical Palestine, and the Zionist entity looting the land and cleansing the people, ethnically cleansing them, as is happening in Jerusalem and parts of the West Bank. So Europe cannot sustain that situation because this is objected by many of the people across Europe and the world. So the people who support Palestine with hundreds of millions today, there is in them globally, they will stand against any government who support Israel. And from here we hear the sounds of sanctions will be imposed in Israel from the British Parliament's groups and other European or even EU politicians. They are scared of this. They don't want to see themselves involved in another South Africa white apartheid imposed in Palestine, because they seen and they saw the result of that. A massive demonstration went in the streets in here till forced Europe to support them in dismantling South Africa apartheid.
Well, Anthony, what about that? The other side of that question, I guess, then, is the Palestinian side. Do you think because, again, as the so-called deal of the century and everything that Palestinians have witnessed over the decades, that really they have gotten to a point that they have to be united. I want to look at as far as that aspect. Do you think with the latest situation that's taking place and the continual taking away of Palestinian lands, protesters being continually maimed, homes being bulldozed, do you think that finally Palestinians, the various Palestinian factions, will be united because they are getting to the point that all of them understand that resistance is the only way?
I heard a very good comment from Abu Ghazala on Rick Wiles' True News. It's an evangelical Christian show, but it's very anti-Zionist. Mm-hmm. And they were interviewing this very renowned business person based in Jordan, a Palestinian called Taleb Abu Ghazala. And I hadn't seen him before, but he made a point of emphasizing that he has never seen such unity among Palestinian people, whether they're in the territory, whether they're in the diaspora, in the region. The Palestinians, in the largest sense, he says you can't point to one Palestinian that agrees with this deal of the century. So there is a tremendous coalescence of Palestinian public opinion right now, and how you express that unity and that solidarity with the larger constituency in the world, which is fed up with this, which is humiliated by this, which shows such contempt that there is no law, there is nothing but bare power, knuckle power. And in that struggle, of course, you know, there's a weaker side and an immensely powerful side in this situation. So the idea of settling it through some kind of clash of fisticuffs or worse doesn't seem to make sense. So this unity is something unique. Donald Trump has kind of galvanized it. Netanyahu has shown he has no respect for law. He puts out the people in his own, the officials in his own government that are pushing for him to be convicted of criminal charges. He just is going to fire them. He's going to shut down the court cases where it happens. There is no rule of law any longer in Israel. And there it is.
And on that note, I appreciate both of you being with us. Out of Lethbridge, author and editor-in-chief of the American Herald Tribune, Anthony Hall, and out of Belfast, author and Middle East affairs expert, Saeb Sha'ath. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing off for myself and all of the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you next time.